This week on Indoctrination, I speak to my former neighbor, Tracy Wolfe. She had to pull her kids out of Glencoe public schools, including New Trier High School, one of the purportedly best schools in the nation, because she thought the school was too woke for her kids. We talk with her about her experience with International Holocaust Remembrance Day being canceled and her work galvanizing parents to make institutional changes at the district. Welcome to Indoctrination, the podcast that exposes and opposes radical ideology in K-12 schools and academia. Each episode, I talk with parents, students, and educators fighting for change. I'm Josh Weiner, your host. Join me and my guests as we shine a light on what's actually happening in K-12 classrooms and what we can do about it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Indoctrination. I'm excited to have Tracy Wolfe on. Tracy, how are you doing today?
Great. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing well. Tracy was a really interesting case for me because I met her a week before I started at Navi. It was like kind of the first thing that I got thrown into. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But Tracy, tell me a little bit about where you used to live, which was right next door to me in Glencoe. How are you related to Glencoe? Like, what were you hoping for your family? And then we can kind of get into what happened at New Trier High School.
Well, I was born and raised in the Chicagoland area. I was actually born in Morton Grove and went to Niles North High School. So I spent most of my childhood years in Morton Grove and Skokie. And I went away for college to Emory, Northwestern Law School, which brought me back to Chicago. And then lived in the city, eventually got married. And when my husband and I decided to start our family, we bought a home in Glencoe, which is where we lived for the last 15 years. We have 3 children, and our oldest one completed her freshman year at New Trier. And then we had a son that was in 6th and a son that was in 4th.
Tell me a little bit about Glencoe. What's the community like?
Glencoe is an amazing community. It's relatively small. I think it's about 5,000 population, and it's close knit. Everyone kind of knows each other. It's beautiful. It's close to the lake. It's very desirable. Hard to get a home there, and it's really like a dream community to live in.
Yeah, like really hard to get a home there. I think Kevin and I were trying to get a home there. It was like impossible. Not that it's easy to get a home in Highland Park now either.
No, it's awesome. And it's a great mix of people and really nice people. And it's got a very cute downtown. It's really a nice place to raise a family.
Yeah, and like when I was growing up, Glencoe, Highland Park, Deerfield, Winnetka, really seen as around the Chicago area as the places with what they would call the best schools, right?
Yes, for sure.
And Glencoe feeds into a high school called New Trier High School, and the other communities that feed into that are south of Glencoe, which goes Winnetka, Kenilworth, Wilmette, right?
Right. And also Glenview, you get even some East Northbrook that goes to New Trier. So it's a very large high school, about a little over 1,000 per grade.
Yeah. And I think it's always ranked in like the top 100 too for the best high schools in the country. It's like a very highly desirable place to be.
For sure. A lot of people move to the area so that they can send their kids to New Trier.
And talk about like the Jewish makeup of your community.
I would just guessing, from what I hear, it was probably about 50-50. And it felt very Jewish, but it also felt like there were a lot of people who weren't. And this was really just in Glencoe, not at New Trier on a whole. And then there were a lot of mixed marriages, where one parent was Jewish, the other parent was Christian or something else. And it didn't feel as stereotypically Jewish as Highland Park is known to be. But we're a pretty Jewish family, and we felt very comfortable there with the amount of Jewish people and just the way that it was as a whole.
So like your immediate community is more Jewish. So your elementary school, your middle school is going to be a bit more Jewish. And then as you get up into the high school, probably less so percentage wise.
For sure. Because as you get to the high school, Kenilworth is almost no Jews. Winnetka is very small amount of Jewish people. Glenview is very little also. So yes, And as it grows, they say that New Trier was maybe like 10% Jewish, if that.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I know the only two Jews in Kenilworth, and they're like very proud of it.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I don't know any, so you're ahead there.
Okay, so you had an incident. I think there was a pattern, but this was the incident that I got involved with, which had to do with International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Tell us what happened.
So it was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the German Alliance Group had an idea to go ahead and connect with the Jewish Affinity Group to make stickers available to the students that said "We remember," that they could wear, and also some flyers like explaining that it was Holocaust Remembrance Day. That was pretty much it. And apparently, the German Alliance Group got permission from whomever they needed it from and to do this. And the night, and everything was ready. The stickers were ready, the flyers were ready, and they were going to be given to the homeroom teachers, they call them advisory, to just have them on the desk for the students to take them if they wanted to. There wasn't really going to be any sort of discussion about it or anything like that. It was just available for the students. And then
Because people probably have there's Holocaust education, so it's not as though there's a whole bunch of programming. It's just, let's just acknowledge it. That's it.
right. And so the night before, the way the story goes, the night before, the person who was in charge in the German Alliance Group got a call on the phone in the evening from one of the administrators and said, don't go forward with that initiative tomorrow in light of the October 7th incident and sensitivity to Palestinian students. So that was what we heard. And you're probably wondering, how did we hear it? Well, about maybe a week later, a teacher intentionally wrote a pretty descriptive and lengthy letter that he or she leaked to the community. And I think that the intention was that it would get out to the community, and it told about this situation with Holocaust Remembrance Day, and also that there were other grievances pertaining to anti-Semitism at New Trier. So that letter circulated all around, for sure, Glencoe and maybe other suburbs that fed into New Trier. I'm not actually sure. And eventually it made it into my inbox. And obviously, when I saw it, I was pretty upset. It seemed outrageous because, for so many reasons, but first and foremost and most easiest, like, what does October 7th have to do with the Holocaust? Absolutely nothing. And why should October 7th bar the students from remembering and acknowledging the Holocaust? It shouldn't. So at first, I was digesting the letter and I was speaking about it with my husband, and we were both pretty upset. And my husband decided that he was going to do something about it. And so he started to write something to the school, but then he got busy with work, and I decided to take over. And basically what I did was I started to send emails to every single person I knew in Glencoe and any suburb that fed into New Trier. It was mostly Glencoe. And it said that I plan to write a letter to New Trier stating that, I'm upset about this. And if you are behind me on this, then please actually acknowledge that you want to be a part of this by sending me an email back. And please send this to anyone who you think might be interested. And it really grew like wildfire. And after a couple days, I had about 100 people who wrote me back and said, I want to be a part of this. Thank you for handling it. So I put together a first letter, and it's talked about the Holocaust Remembrance Day and why did that happen. And then a few other situations that I had heard about via this this letter. And then that's how this initiative started.
Yeah, before you get into kind of how the administration responded, tell me about the environment at New Trier after October 7th. What sort of things were red flags, would you say, in the months after?
Well, right after October 7th happened, the first week, there was really nothing, because I think nobody really knew how to respond. And when I first contacted the school and asked about the Holocaust Remembrance Day before I wrote the letter, the response was basically very rote, like, we're here to support any students in any way they need. And, but they really didn't have answers. And we had, there wasn't really anything that had happened surrounding October 7th, except that was just it. There was nothing. There was no discussion about it, no support about it. No, they basically said that they don't talk about the Ukrainian war. So why will they talk about what had just happened on October 7th? That was the initial response. So from there, that's why we felt like we needed to take a step further and, dig deeper and get more aggressive.
Okay. So you mentioned there were a couple of other incidents that you learned from somebody when you were drafting this letter. Tell me about that.
Yes. I had learned that they had this monthly observance calendar that they called it. And it basically, a different ethnic group was marginalized, or a different marginalized ethnic group was recognized each month. But who decided which group was considered marginalized was up to, it seemed like, this DEI committee. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But the DEI committee was made up of these three people, and they didn't have any training. So we'll come back to that. So we realized, for example, that March 2022 was named Antisemitism month or / Passover, where every other month had people-centric names. So they had, different names like Arab American month or things like that. And there was no month designated to the Jewish people. There was no month designated to, the Chinese students. There was no, but they picked, and then there happened to be 2 months that were designated towards Arab-centric groups. They just had different names. And when we brought that up, and we'll get...
What were the names?
One of them was Muslim Heritage Month, and the other one was Arab American Heritage Month.
Okay. Were they discernibly different in the type of programming that they did?
No, basically when these months would come along, they would maybe send out some articles or, things like there would be a different picture on the calendar, but maybe there would be some materials that were available. But I don't actually know how different these were, but that would be the equivalent of having an Israel month and a Jewish Heritage month, but they had neither.
Okay. All right, continue.
So that was one of the grievances that, and here's an example. For Muslim Heritage Month, Muslim American Heritage Month in January, every faculty and staff member received a calendar with links to different articles or videos to read and or watch with their students. And many of the articles were very political in nature and upset the Jewish teachers. And they may have highlighted the effects of the war in the Middle East, but really focused on the Palestinians and seemed to favor the Palestinian side, kind of driving the kids to choose a side. They were published and they were easy to locate them, if any student wanted to find them. But when we asked Paul who chose the articles and who picked these in particular, Paul Sally was the superintendent. And when we asked him, me being we, who actually chose these articles, picked these things, there was really no answer. There was no sort of protocol as to what articles were being accessible to these students. And some of them were very polarizing, or they were very slanted, biased. So that was the issue. And that was what, for example, when I started to aggregate all of my information to write the letter, this is where I was learning about all these grievances from discussions with various teachers that wanted to tell me things anonymously.
So it's interesting because they also said, we don't discuss the Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian-Russian war. Why would we discuss the Israel-Gaza war? However, it seems during the programming, there was a political point of view about the ongoing conflict, even prior to October 7th, between Israel and Palestine.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Another thing that we learned about was there was a poster on the wall, in one of the walls at school, and There was actually a duplicate of this poster, and I just want to look at my notes so I get exactly what it said right. But it said, "Dear," and then it was a blank. You insert the race or culture. "Dear blank students." And it separated each group by race or culture, and it inserted a stereotype that said, for example, "You are not a terrorist," to the Muslim students. And it said, like, to the "Dear Mexican students, you are not a drug lord," something to that effect. Dear, so it created these stereotypes, and it was so outlandish. Not only did it not include Jewish students, which personally I wouldn't want it to, because what are they going to say? "Dear Jewish students, you don't have big noses." I don't know what it's going to say, but it didn't even include Jewish students, but then it created these terrible stereotypes.
I could only imagine. Right.
And I also addressed that in my letter. And Paul Sally, the superintendent, said that he had no awareness of that letter, of that poster, and then when he looked into it, he came back to me and said that poster was from an initiative a few years prior, and that all of them were taken down. I had a lot of responses to that. A, they were not taken down, which is how I saw them. I had a student take pictures of them and send them to me the day of. And B, what initiative would make that type of poster acceptable? I can't understand. It's just very stereotypical driven, and just like really creates wedges, and terrible things are being said about groups of people that, if students didn't actually think that Muslims are terrorists, well, now they're going to look at that and say, wow, are Muslims terrorists? Never knew that.
Right. Like, let's reinforce stereotypes in the classroom. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Really bad idea. So, like, Paul said this was from a couple of years ago. However, you had proof that it was like on the wall at the time. And was there not really a response to this?
100%. He just told me later that, if it was still up, it was going to be taken down that day. And I believe it was taken down eventually, but it was still there. Two of them were there when I wrote this letter, 2 school years ago. So, yes.
Okay. So you wrote this letter, you got hundreds of signatures, it sounds like. What was the response from Paul?
Well, at first I wrote him the letter and copied everyone in the community on it, and explained in my letter that all the people that were on this email were behind this letter and this initiative, and they had these questions. I asked him for a town hall meeting so that everyone could hear his responses together. He told me that he was not going to have a town hall meeting, but he invited me and or my husband to come and meet with him at any point in time. So, I pushed back a couple times. I asked him to have a meeting because I said that everybody wanted to be a part of it and hear the responses, but ultimately he wouldn't agree to that. So I did just go into his office and I had a meeting with him. And my husband and I felt like we didn't get clear answers on really anything that happened. He would punt. He would say, well, that was an accident that poster was still up, or that was an administrative mistake that the Arab culture, the Muslim culture got 2 months, and that, the Jewish culture didn't get any months, or the Polish culture didn't get any months. I'll look into it. Everything was, I'll look into it. We might need to do better. It was all just very generalized responses, but really with no meat or grit to them. He really had no response about International Holocaust Remembrance Day that suited me. His response was that the teachers did not have ample time to answer any important questions that would have come up. And my response to that was, this was not supposed to be an educational moment. It was during a 10-minute advisory class where it wasn't even really supposed to be a discussion. It was just handing them out. So anyone who wanted to wear it, like wearing a gay pride sticker, anything, vote today sticker, anyone who wanted to wear it could put it on. There really wasn't supposed to be a discussion. However, if a student had a question, like, can you tell me a little bit about the Holocaust? Did that actually happen? When did that happen? I would think that the teacher should have enough knowledge about such a huge event in history, that they should be able to answer the basic questions. And if they couldn't answer the basic questions, they could have said, that's a great question. Let me get back to you on that. But it shouldn't have been a reason to stop this whole initiative. To us, the community, and everybody who was behind me on that letter, it seemed like it had everything to do with October 7th and nothing to do with any of his excuses.
Okay. And did they do anything to make up for it, or it was just excuses?
Well, ultimately, after me speaking at multiple board meetings and many letters, they did agree to recognize Yom HaShoah, which is it's when Israel recognizes the Holocaust Remembrance Day in May. And they did have like a seminar in their gym, and anyone who wanted to come could come, and they spoke about it. But, that was 4 or 5 months later, and it was already after the fact. And that was his apology amends, and to some in the community that appeased them. To me, I felt like there were bigger issues. And for us and the group that I formed with your help, we really discovered that the root of the issues was with the 3 DEI officers that were seemingly making these decisions at the school, even though Paul Sally would tell us always that they weren't the ones making these decisions, that he was the one that was responsible for these decisions. But there were these 3 people that were the DEI initiatives, they called it, the DEI liaisons. One woman was Pat Savage Williams. She's an African-American woman that has a very colorful history related to white privilege and really just she also works at Evanston Township High School, and where
She's the school board president.
the school board president. And then at New Trier, she was really just a sitting member of the DEI committee. And why I say that, because she had another title, but it didn't seem like she actually worked in any other department at the school except for the DEI department. And then there was another woman that worked with her named Kiran Subani. Kiran is Muslim, and she wore a hijab before October 7th. But then on October 8th, she began wearing a keffiyeh to school. And for those of you who don't know, a keffiyeh is basically like a modern day swastika. And it became that on October 7th because all of the Hamas freedom fighters were wearing the keffiyeh around their necks and their heads when they brutally attacked, murdered, assaulted, and raped all of the Jewish people in Israel.
I just want to like solidify this a little bit more because it requires more context for a lot of people, right? Because, it's often told that this is a Palestinian cultural and identity symbol. However, it's actually a headscarf that was appropriated from southern Iraq. And it started to become popular in the 1960s when Yasser Arafat started the PLO, which the PLO committed many acts of terrorism in the name of what they referred to as Palestinian liberation with this keffiyeh on.
That's right. So that was DEI liaison number 2. The third person was a man, a white man that seemed to really have not much of a say, and he just went along with the 2 others. When I met with Paul Sally and I asked him, how did these 3 people get elected? Was it by the community? Was it by the teachers? He had no answer. It seemed like they were handpicked and chosen. Also, I asked him, do you think that this is a good representation of our community? And, he really couldn't answer that. I mean, how could it be? It was only 3 people. We have a very diverse community at New Trier. There wasn't even one Jewish person on that when, like I just mentioned, Glencoe is like 50% Jewish. And there seemed to be one person who was even anti-Semitic. So another example of how they used to involve themselves in the school is in November, after October 7th, the New Trier News had published a staff editorial that was entitled, "We must educate ourselves about the Israel-Hamas war using unbiased facts." This was a class, okay, like a group, like a club at the school. It has nothing to do with the DEI officials. The point of the article was that while social media is an important and useful tool, but it is not always credible, and that students should seek out established publications in obtaining their news, okay? The article identified 4 news sources. It identified AP Newsroom, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and one other one that I'm not actually sure of at this point. And then in January, the DEI liaisons, they came into the room, they visited the journalism class out of nowhere, and they conveyed their views that all American media, whether it's right-leaning or left-leaning, was biased towards Israel. They suggested to the class that they should get a balanced perspective and that they should visit Al Jazeera and any other far left-leaning media sources and pro-Palestinian sources to get a different perspective. And this was what they conveyed to the classroom. Of course, I was pretty upset by this, and so were other parents, especially Jewish parents of the Jewish journalist students in that class. Because why is this even the DEI liaison's jurisdiction? It was satisfactory for the teacher. You know, these students wrote a good article. The article was already out and published, and they came back to them with this, like after the fact tidbit, their opinion that they should look at Al Jazeera and Haaretz and The Guardian and Plus 972 magazine. These are all very left-leaning and left-leaning, and you know that was problematic.
Not to mention Al Jazeera's Qatari state-backed media. It's funded by Qatar. In fact, I think now if you watch Al Jazeera videos on YouTube, it says it in the corner that this is funded by Qatar. That is just, it's not going to be a balanced view. And it's interesting that they didn't bring like an institutional neutrality to the table, but really just left-leaning sources.
Yes. So, and again, there was no resolution to that. You know, there were a lot of situations that were brought to my attention. Unfortunately, many teachers ended up calling me anonymously with their grievances. And of course, they wanted to be anonymous because they wanted to keep their jobs. Some of them were waiting for pension and things like that. But the things that I was hearing about what they were having to go through, or certain experiences that they had at the school, were really disappointing. So with this one, this was brought to my attention by a parent, and she was trying to fight that fight. And when I asked her if I could, help, she wanted to handle it on her own because her son was involved. And there were a lot of situations like that where parents were upset or teachers were upset, but they had to consider other things before they could go ahead and take that grievance to the school. I was willing to go ahead and do that despite any sort of problems it might have created for my daughter, who was a freshman at the time, or for, me in the community. Of course, I had so many supporters and people were unbelievable and very interested in what I was doing and wanting to help. But there were definitely a handful of people who, for lack of a better word, made me their enemies because I was looked at as like the bad guy. So it was difficult.
Let's talk about teacher programming, because ultimately what you train your teachers ends up being what the teachers teach their students. And I understand there were a few different incidents. One of them had to do with, like, I really want to get into this Al-Khat prayer.
Yeah. Okay. So they were, a lot of the teacher programming came from this woman named Peggy McIntosh, the SEED project. And this dates...
Sorry, SEED is Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity, and Pat Savage-Williams is part of this as well.
Right. And so it's this very archaic way of thought, and it really is about like white privilege, basically just going on and on about how the white man is privileged and everyone else is really not, and in a terrible position. And it creates a lot of victimization, and it creates a lot of anger and misunderstanding and, et cetera. So at New Trier, there was a huge focus on color of the skin. It's same, from what I hear, also at Evanston, where Pat Savage-Williams was the connecting tie to both schools. So there was this workshop in January of 2020. And it was at New Trier for the teachers, and it was for them to choose which classes they wanted to take to, get a little bit of continued education. So one of the workshops was called The Empathy Gap, Assimilation Through Aesthetics, and it was offered to all faculty and staff as a lunch and learn. The description of the workshop was as follows. It is well documented that during the civil rights movement, Jewish people and African American worked together in solidarity to fight against acts of racism and anti-Semitism. However, more recently, there seems to be an empathy gap that exists between Jews and people of color. While both groups continue to be marginalized, there does not seem to be the same level of solidarity as there was in the past. We will work to examine the circumstances and emotions that have led to this change. We will discuss the intersectionality of race and religion and how the importance of isolating race helps us to understand how certain marginalized groups can still benefit from institutionalized racism because of their skin color. We will examine how white supremacy runs through our country, given the fact that even people who have been persecuted, such as Jewish people, have still been able to benefit from the systems currently in place. This is largely due to the option of assimilation for white Jews.
This was called the empathy gap, right?
We can unpack that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So obviously, in response, the Jewish faculty were outraged. Like, how can this be offered, let alone in a high school, let alone in a high school where there's a lot of Jewish people? And why is this even relevant, right? So many questions.
Also, there's an assertion here that this gap exists without having a conversation even. It's sort of one-sided to say, these people of color are coming in and they're saying there's a gap and we have a problem. And there's no agency for the Jewish people that are part of this to have an opinion about this. It's just, we're on our back foot now because we're white Jews who are adjacent to white supremacy, right? Correct.
Exactly. So the teachers were really upset. A handful of them went and spoke to the administration, Paul Sally, and the only solution was that they didn't apologize, really. They didn't, they just said, we won't do it again. Okay, so they said that they were no longer going to do that workshop. And what happened subsequently, a few months later, there was a follow-up meeting with the Jewish faculty and some of the staff. Tim Hayes, who is the white DEI liaison, the white male that I mentioned before, he invited a woman named Corey Wallace to the meeting. Corey Wallace is a paid person, so taxpayer dollars paid her a lot to come to the school, where she basically talks about these sorts of things, racial issues, DEI, this is her field. So she begins the meeting by passing out information to the people that are there, and she gives out flyers about BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction materials. And the agenda for that, if people don't know, is to boycott everything that comes from Israel. Okay, so that's how she decides to...
By the way, Corey was part of SEED. She was the Chicagoland coordinator for the National SEED Project at this time. Yeah, and I mean, I see hundreds of thousands of dollars were paid to her. I'm not sure exactly if it was just New Trier, but I am aware that SEED Project has contracts across the north and northwest suburbs.
Oh, yeah. If you Google SEED and Corey Wallace, I mean, these people are making a lot of money going around and spewing this type of rhetoric. So she starts the meeting like that, gives out these materials, and of course, she upsets all the Jewish teachers. And now remember that this meeting was set to sort of keep going over the mistake that happened last time with the empathy gap. So that's how this meeting starts off. So the Jewish teachers are upset, and that meeting ends. And later, a little bit later, in August 2020, everybody discharges for the summer. They're coming back. They're setting up. This is the way a teacher explained it to me. They're setting up for school, and it's late August, and Rosh Hashanah, Jewish holiday, is around the corner. Corey Wallace sends out an email to 18 faculty and staff that she selected who attended her previous meeting where she gave out the BDS materials. And she sends out this email that basically says, gearing up for the school year, just want to make sure everyone's in a good place. And in light of the Jewish holidays that are coming up, I recommend that you recite this Al-Khat prayer. And she puts the entire prayer in her email.
But before you go, so like Al-Khat, yeah, Al-Khat is like a prayer that Jews say during Yom Kippur as atonement for sins. So this is like I mean, for lack of a better way to say it, an adulterated version.
Yes, very. It was a crazy adulterated version because basically, I'll quote, it said that you were supposed to ask for repentance, quote, for the sins we have committed through the denial of Selam Elohim, the divine spark within Black bodies, for the sins we have committed through segregating Black bodies from participation and leadership within our institutions, for the sins we have committed in deceiving others by not teaching our children the worth, value, and contributions of Black people, for the sins we have committed in not honoring and protecting the journeys of Black elders and Black children, for the sins we have committed in commoditizing Black people and Black bodies in our business dealings. It goes on and on and on and on. There were so many. And then, of course, okay, go ahead. I didn't know how many we should go into.
Can I say some more? Because there's like really, I just like they're my least favorite. I just had to give some. For the sins we have committed through insisting on urgency and perfectionism as a measure of human value. So this is from a concept called white supremacy culture framework that literally tells children that things like perfectionism, being on time, aka urgency, objectivity, are white supremacist values. And it's really bad because it actually infers that people of color cannot hold to these standards, which are typical standards for productivity and success. For the sins we have committed through turning Black bodies into objects of lust and sexual gratification. For the sins we have committed that desecrate the divine name by allowing white supremacy habits to shape/determine our practice of Judaism. So now we're talking about our practice of Judaism being white supremacist. Sorry, I had to give those ones were particularly bad to me. So
I mean, obviously it was crazy. And this was emailed to teachers. And it's like our taxpayer dollars, my taxpayer dollars, paid Corey Wallace to email this to my fellow teachers to ask them to apologize for these sins that they have committed against the Black people. I mean, it was really outrageous. Okay. So
I want to be sort of just make sure. So Corey is Black and purportedly Jewish.
Purportedly. And, you know, I'd love to know if she uses that as a way to get her foot in the door for Jewish organizations. I have no idea, but that's how she describes herself. So the thing is about what happened here, and this was really unfortunate, is it went very, apparently, you know, the way one of the teachers explained it to me is that they all disliked Corey Wallace so much that they were busy with the start of the year. And when they got an email from Corey, they just sort of ignored it. You know, they were like, she has nothing useful to say. So many of them missed the prayer because it was embedded. It was like a link to the Al-Khat prayer. And it said, I recommend that you click on this and recite it. So many of them missed this. It wasn't really until, I would say even most of them, I don't know if any of them actually read it. And it wasn't until I got involved and started to really dig into everything. And this was by way of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, to get my hands on emails and to look into how much Corey Wallace was being paid and to, you know, read itineraries for seminars and things like that. And that's when I uncovered this prayer. And so what's interesting about it is it was never addressed. The school never really apologized for it. Corey never took ownership for it or explained it. And these grievances just kept on repeating themselves. So after I talked about that empathy gap seminar that was given at school, and teachers were pretty upset about that. And with that, they did go to Paul Sally and explain to them like that sort of lesson shouldn't be given. And it continued. What happened after that in my discovery, I learned that the next year, a bunch of New Trier teachers attended the National Summit of Courageous Conversations in October in October 2022 in Washington, D.C. And again, the taxpayer dollars went to this. And there were 2 New Trier faculty members who presented a seminar there. One of them was Jewish and one was Black. 6 other faculty members attended, and one of them was Pat Savage Williams. And we discovered that they actually gave the exact same empathy gap seminar that the teachers were upset about the year prior. They gave it again. They just called it something different. And when I approached Paul Sally about that, he said that that wasn't the case. And again, I saw this by looking with FOIA requests and finding all of these, like I found the itinerary. And what this particular seminar was called, it was called Juxtapose Assimilation Stories. But the subject matter was described almost exactly the same. It said, the following is a description of the workshop. The session will focus on how skin color impacts the ability to assimilate within the United States. We will explore how the option to assimilate has provided opportunities for some immigrant groups while excluding others. A Black Christian Haitian immigrant and a second-generation white Jewish American of German descent will share their racial autobiography and experiences. We will discuss the intersection of race and religion to isolate race and consider why certain marginalized groups benefit from institutionalized racism because of their skin color. Examining the presence and of the role of whiteness and belonging is essential to how and why our systems benefit certain groups over others. Participants will reflect on their own histories and examine what privileges they may or may not have been afforded. So they basically just reworded that seminar and gave it again, even though a bunch of teachers were so upset, and this has no relevance in, day-to-day academics.
Wow. Were you also involved when Pat Savage Williams participated in the White Privilege Conference? Do you know about this?
I wasn't, but I know all about it. Yes.
So there's this conference in, I think it was like Mesa, Arizona. And when the parents spoke up about it, Pat Savage Williams also basically accused white parents of stirring controversy. So I think just it's important to solidify how antagonizing it is to Jewish people for constantly basically blaming them for being white adjacent or upholding the white supremacy, because our history is of being accused of tainting the Aryan white race, and that our persecution from the Nazis was particularly because we were not considered white. It's really hard for Jewish people who really understand their history to hear these things, while also knowing that we've been, as a community, probably the biggest proponents for equality and for, I'd say, the advancement of Black people in society, since they have had historical disadvantages that we all know about. For a long time, but especially the work that has been done since the 1950s into the current time by Jewish community leaders.
100%. I mean, when Black Lives Matters was really a thing, I know that every single one of my Jewish friends was marching alongside them. And when October 7th happened, who was marching alongside the Jewish people? Nobody. And, this is all these are the reasons that these things are very upsetting. It just seems to be very in vogue right now to want to blame the whites, and then the Jews are considered, the ultimate whites running Hollywood or whatever it is that they're saying. And on top of it being white people. So it's like a double negative.
Yeah, it's like the history too is like the signs used to be whites only, no colors, no Jews, no dogs, right? And even the history of our community, or your former community, Tracy, we'll talk about that a little bit. Highland Park is largely a Jewish community because it was one of the first communities in Illinois to actually welcome Jews into the neighborhood. So, this shared history is just being erased, I would say.
It just seemed like it's really sadly going away. Education is going so far away from, the basic core subjects and really just studying the math and the science. And it's all just about, this like social justice issues. And that seems to be what they are spending the majority of their time on in schools. It's this woke catechism of DEI and, taking DEI and really just like rebranding it and using it for in every angle except for what it was really intended for. When you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sounds amazing. Who's not for that? We're all for that. But then when you take a school and all they're doing there is teaching these empathy gaps and they're actually creating more racism and more division and it's going in the opposite direction, and they're not focusing on academics anymore.
Yeah, and this is what we're focused on. The idea that what we're teaching kids is to lean into victimhood, lean into guilt, depending on what your identity is, what your intersectional identity is, and the wheel of privilege, if you will. And it's really taking agency away from people and children. And we're orienting them towards blaming the system rather than having grit and overcoming and resilience. And there's clearly a balance there. Like it can't be only grit and it can't be only the system's fault, right? Like there's something in between. But we're really teaching, I think, in a lot of these programs, which come from like How to Be an Anti-Racist and Robin DiAngelo's book, White Privilege, they say all of these equity gaps, basically outcomes that don't match the makeup of the population by race and ethnicity, they're driven by unfair, supremacist, racist systems. Maybe that's partially true, but they're basically teaching that this is completely true. And the only way to solve this problem is to create activists in the classroom who will tear those systems down.
Right. And that just seemed to be like what the focus was at New Trier, which, is ultimately, and I'm sure you were going to ask me about this, but why we decided to just literally pick up and move our family to Florida.
Yeah, so this is like amazing to me because like I grew up here and I like love it and I think it's such a great community. And I mentioned this earlier. It's like this is the place where the schools are so great and people still say, "Oh, you have great schools. That's, like this is like the best place to raise kids." But it's really disappointing because this is especially a place where they're leaning into these things. So just like tell me about like when we were together working on this issue, you were like amazing because everybody was looking to you to really lead this charge against the school, or at least in collaboration with the school to make some change if they would have it. And it seemed like endless, and it seemed like it was kind of like you take 2 steps forward, maybe a half step back, or 1 step forward, 3 steps back. But like, when did it become just like, okay, I've had it, that it's just not going to change here? Yeah.
I mean, basically if it was just like a New Trier thing and that's it, maybe it would have been a little bit easier to tolerate, and there would have been more optimism. But then when you look at our city, and our mayor and our governor and like just the way that things were moving on a whole, and seeing all the encampments at Northwestern, and I live right by there, and having to drive by that, and then knowing your fight at DePaul, and never wanting to go down to downtown to Chicago because I would be, in the midst of all these sorts of protests. That's when it got too big for my mind to handle. Also, I have 2 younger kids, and I knew that they were going to have to go through New Trier, and I didn't see any change happening. And it was also happening in the lower schools. The lower schools were talking so much about sexuality, asking the kids through different various surveys, like so many questions about their sexuality. There was even an exercise that I learned about, a Spanish class exercise, a homework assignment that made its way around in my group of activists, that was a middle school assignment. And it basically was just like a paragraph in Spanish, and then you were supposed to answer some multiple choice questions. The paragraph was about a man, a boy that was transgender, that he liked to dress in a dress, he liked to dance, et cetera, et cetera. So the focus was really about him being transgender. And then you were to answer all these questions. Why do they have to do that? I just don't understand. Like, it's confusing enough to learn Spanish, but then to have to think about, is this kid a boy or is he a girl? And the questions were basically like that. Is he a boy? Does he like to wear dresses? It's just, I don't understand why education is going in this direction. And it seemed like,
because it's like, this is you think it's the DEI liaisons and it's like a homeroom thing, but it ends up being like, we just uncovered all the curriculum in Philadelphia, and the entire social studies and history curriculum is based on power and privilege. You get to this gender issue, and actually biology classes are starting to get away from biological sex and bringing gender into the discussion around biological sex. We have seen math lessons where you have the typical, like, Johnny's going with his mom from this distance at that mile per hour versus, Jeffrey and his mom. And then it's, well, before we solve the problem, we need to talk about who had the privilege of having two parents and going to an amusement park. And then we don't learn how to do math. We just learn about privilege. So I just solidifying the point that this is like, it's become so ingrained in every lesson that it's not even that we're not focused on math class. It's that math class is focused on privilege.
right. So, I mean, that answers your question. I was so knee deep in it, and it was so upsetting that I was literally so stressed out, losing sleep, tightly wound, and everyone in my community, and when I say community, I mean the people that I was working with, you and all the other people that were helping me, supporting me, were encouraging me to run for board. And so that was basically when I made the decision, because I started to look into running for board, and it's very hard to get elected. It's a very political position. And furthermore, it's a lot of work, unpaid work, and it's a lot of work. And I knew the players on the board, and most of them did not agree with my positions. Many of them were, just especially as it related to Judaism. There were no Jews on the board, or there may have been one that was half, and it was just not important to them. And I didn't see any change happening. And I'm not trying to be a martyr here. I was a lawyer by trade. I practiced law for 14 years. And for the past several years, I've been a yoga teacher. I've been just trying to find, mostly peace in my life. I've always been very passionate about Judaism and all any sort of initiative relating to Judaism. And I'll fight, a good fight when it comes to that, but not at the expense of my health and at my kids' education. And I just felt like the more we learned about Florida, we realized that here there's no tolerance for any of that. And it's not even like we moved to a Jewish neighborhood. We're in Fort Lauderdale. It's not particularly very Jewish. And our kids go to a private school that's non-denominational. But here there's no tolerance for any of that. It's just about education. It's about math, science, English, history. They don't talk about sex or gender or anything like that. It's accepted. No one cares. They don't talk about race. Again, it's accepted. No one cares. No one needs to prove that they don't care. No one needs to prove that they accept everyone else. It just is. And that's an environment for me where you feel less of a divide. There's plenty of Black kids at their school, and they're not called out in any way. And I don't know that they would want to be.
Yeah. So if you had to say in one sentence why you moved from Glencoe to Florida, what would it be?
We got freedom. Freedom from these like shackles of feeling like we needed to be jailed to these new woke parameters that if we didn't fall within those woke parameters, we're considered intolerant. No, it's not that we're intolerant. I just don't care. I have my own issues, and I don't make everyone else like knowledge, in tune to my issues and sensitive to them and having to deal with them. My issues are my issues. I don't care who Joe Schmo is having sex with or what religion he is. I just want him to stay in his lane. And, I just feel when it comes to school, we're all supposed to be there to learn about those basic materials. And a lot of these children, it's too young for them to be aware of these things. It's too many decisions. And many of these discussions are really for them to be having at home or later on, but that was a really long one sentence, but we got freedom. And that's why I feel like we moved.
It was good. It was good. I mean, it's the truth. Yeah. Um, and it's not even just like that, probably, but also how ingrained in the system it is that you were trying to be a change agent. But in order to do it, would have been like you could have spent years and made minimal progress because things like in order to get elected for school board to have a chance, you need to be endorsed by the Women's League of Voters. And they think that what you're talking about, they would say you're intolerant. We would never endorse you.
Completely.
So how can you make change?
I knew that also. So I knew that I probably wouldn't win for Board of Education. And not to mention along the way, I was making enemies, and I do have thick skin, but there were some people that I had once upon a time considered friends who, were, I was seeing them in a different light, and it wasn't pleasant. Like sometimes you just don't want to see that stuff, or, you don't want to welcome more unrest and like more just depression like into your life. And I just feel like since there was an opportunity and another place with better schools that focus really just on education and not all of these social justice issues, we just were going to head there. We were going to be better off in the long run. And so far we found that we are.
So you're happy with the new school? You think it's going well? Is there anywhere that it's
So happy.
too far in the other direction, or would you say it's just perfect for you guys?
No, because it's not like it's completely no, it's not very conservative, it's not very liberal. It just is about school. And if any issues seem to come up, they just nip them in the bud right away. And nobody really hears about it. It doesn't become, they just handle it with that student. And it's just really focused on education. They don't really talk about all the other things, these social justice issues. So I think that for us, it was a really good move. I feel like that weight has been lifted. It was a very stressful year for me with October 7th and then fighting the fight that I was fighting. And not to mention, my daughter was amazing and very supportive, but she was young and a freshman. And you have no idea how a teacher might look at her or treat her, should she have a teacher that disagrees with me. So I was putting her in a volatile situation as well. And then if we stayed there, it would have been the same with my boys. So for us, it was the right decision.
Well, we miss you. And I know a lot of the community does.
Yeah. I miss it there too.
I know.
I started out by saying how amazing Glencoe is. And it really is. Glencoe is the most beautiful town. I miss it. I just feel like the school is not what it once was.
So you're very lucky to have been able to move. There's a lot of circumstances that make it difficult for others to move. What's your advice for a parent that moving is not an option for them and they have kids in high school and middle school in the Glencoe, Highland Park, Evanston area?
I think they do need to keep on fighting. There's many amazing activists in the area, and they need to reach out to them, including you and every other person that's fighting this fight. And if anyone, has any questions on who to reach out to, they can certainly ask me. But I think if you don't feel like you can do the dirty work, then at least give your information to other people. And don't think like what you are feeling doesn't make a difference or what you want to say won't matter, because it does. It just may take a while. And we did make some progress. From what I heard, they got rid of the 3 DEI liaisons and brought in a whole new crew. I don't know who chose them or how many they chose or where they chose them from, but I know at least our protests had that result. And I think that was a good result. And Pat Savage Williams is no longer with New Trier. And, I don't know what the reasons are for that, but she's not there anymore. and Paul Sally is leaving next year. So I don't know, if we had anything to do with it, but I say you have to keep on fighting no matter what, and you have to put yourself in the situation where you might get uncomfortable, but it's the only way we're going to make change in this world.
And what about like a newish parent who has a kid who's maybe in pre-K, getting ready to get into elementary school? Like, what's your advice for them? They may not even know that this is going on until they get there.
Super important to look at all the work that your child is doing. I never used to look because I always thought it was acceptable. And especially when they were young, and look at their work, ask them questions, ask them if they get asked any personal questions in the age appropriate way. But sometimes they're being asked questions like, what is their sex? And do they feel like they are actually that sex? And do they feel like their parents support whatever sex they feel like they are? Like, should these questions be asked? And, make sure you know what your child is doing every day and get more involved. I think that the time, unfortunately, is these times right now, we need to be involved. We need to know what they're learning. We need to know who the players are. We need to know, I would ask whatever school you're going to, is there a DEI committee? Who chooses the people on the committee? What do they oversee? How much influence do they have over decisions that take place in the school? All these sorts of questions.
What are their measurable outcomes? How is the DEI program successful?
Exactly. Who's paying for it? What do our tax dollars go to? Also, if you do have any questions, if you're at a public school, anything is really, you have access to basically any emails or any information by Freedom of Information Act request. It's not always the easiest thing to obtain, but it's not that hard.
Yeah, they make it difficult, but you get an organization like ours involved. We can guide parents on exactly what to do, exactly how to frame the ask, if you will.
Right. So this is how we found out about the different seminars that that they were giving, and who taught them, and how much money was being spent on certain things. That's how we got all that information.
I have like one more question. How do we make this something that's not a MAGA thing, right? Like, I feel like we have people who talk about this and have concerns about it, and the people who are loud about it are then framed as like, you're MAGA, you're Trump, like these are right-wing talking points. How do we really start to make this a mainstream issue that people that are moderate left, moderate right care about and feel comfortable talking about it?
Well, I think that's a great question, but I think it starts with, even people like you someone like you who obviously, was probably more left leaning once upon a time. And now you're, I don't, it's hard to answer this question, but I do think
it's like this, there's a thing now. It's like you're sitting on the political spectrum just left of center, and then all of a sudden the left gets like extended and it looks like you're on the right, but it hasn't changed really. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. I do feel like in the past 6 months, ever since Trump's been in power, I think it has lessened a little bit. I do think that there was initial shock when he said he was going to do away with DEI. And I think that there's like less of this DEI talk, and it's becoming less and less of a thing. Now it's less prevalent than it was exactly 1 year ago. So I do think we're moving away from that. And I think that the left is doing that for us because they're becoming so far left that they're ostracizing their own people. So especially with, what's happening in New York right now, and it just continues to happen. So I think that that's happening on its own. That's like undoing itself, and that just needs time.
Yeah, and this is my worry for, I'm gay, and my worry is that my gay community, whatever that means, we like to create this idea that we're collective communities when we're all really individuals. They are getting so extreme in what they talk about that they've become sort of a part of this unelectable narrative. And at the end of the day, it's actually enabling the people who want to take their rights away to do it, because you're not creating a power balance that's actually moderate. You're creating one that's more extreme because they're very anti what you're doing because you're extreme. It's like this pendulum.
I totally see what you're saying. And you and Kevin, your husband, are one of the only two guys I know who are brave enough to be outwardly spoken about, your conservative views as it relates to DEI, if you want to call them that, when you're so liberal, socially. And we need more, when it comes to that niche, we need more people who are willing to speak out like you and educate people. Because I know that most of my gay friends would never support Trump and therefore will always support DEI because he's anti-DEI. And like you said, it's like a vicious cycle. So I think with that's a whole nother subject and an amazing podcast that you can do. But we need more people to speak out, for like you. And we need more socially liberal people like me, because I'm completely socially liberal, to speak out on behalf against DEI and against these issues that I'm now talking about. But a lot of people just they just want to live their lives, unfortunately. And they don't want to get their hands dirty.
I was even at the Gay Pride Parade on Sunday, a couple days ago. I guess it'll be a couple weeks ago by the time this gets on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Music. And I was accused of voting for Donald Trump, and I did nothing of the sort, just because I talk about these issues. But just to solidify that point, it's just interesting how people, there's these issues and they're toxic, and the minute that you take a stance on it, you must be MAGA or you must be a socialist. It's either one of the two.
I think it's such an important issue to dive into right now, but our world has gone so far extreme both ways that it's a really tough subject to educate on.
Tracy, I just want to say thank you for everything that you did when you're in this community, everything you still do. Your impact in Glencoe is lasting. I still hear about you all the time, and in positive ways always. And look, you should take credit for the changes that happened at New Trier. Obviously, there's systemic things that still need to happen, but those things were really driven by your efforts. So thank you for the impact you had on your community.
Thank you so much. And really, you were a huge instrumental help. And we became really good friends through this, because you are really have a big heart. And it's an unbelievable thing to make your life's work about making lasting impacts and changes. So we need more people like you. You're awesome. So thank you.
Thank you. You too. I'll see you next time in Florida when it's not so hot. Okay.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye, Tracy.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. If you like the podcast and wish to support our work, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on our social media channels @Navi Values.